Welcome to CBH. We have a special guest, the illustrious Jim Steranko, who has made several impacts on comic history throughout the years. Jim, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Jim, I wanted to start from the beginning. You were born in the 1930s, and you have a lot of experience just from the Great Depression era and after. As a kid, you were reading newspaper comic strips, Alex Raymond, Hal Foster, Milton Caniff. Tell us, as a kid, the impact those images had on you growing up.
Actually, it was rare that I saw those artists, Flash Gordon, more Prince Valiant. Certainly, Caniff was out there, but I grew up in a very poor background, cold poor, hungry poor. And the only newspaper we really got was a Sunday paper in my area. And the reason we got that paper, I believe, was because the entire section only cost 10 cents, while the Philly Inquirer Sunday section cost 15. That may sound preposterous to you in these days, but when I was a kid, every cent counted. My father built the home that we lived in. It was a shack, essentially 3 converted rooms, a kitchen, a living room, a bedroom. It was heated by a kitchen coal stove. Not only was all the cooking done on that stove, but the coal stove heated the house, the whole house. It was very crude, and the fire on this little stove would often go out at night so that when we awoke on winter mornings, it was as cold inside as outside. I sometimes tell the story when people ask me, well, what did you draw on? 2 things. In the summertime, because we could not afford a nickel for a tablet for me to draw on, I very carefully cut open envelopes that statements and bills came in to get to the clean paper on the inside to use as a drawing surface. In the wintertime, it was so cold in our place that ice formed on the inside of the windows. With the heat of my fingertips, I would practice drawing pictures on the ice on the inside of the windows. We had a very difficult and anti-cultural kind of background. And during the war years, World War II, I collected newspapers from people in the neighborhood and tied up bundles that I would sell to paper companies at whatever the going rate was. It could be 40 cents for 100 pounds of papers. But 40 cents meant a lot to me. That was 4 new comic books I could buy.
That's right, yeah.
Or it could be 30 or 40 used comic books I could buy at 2 cents a pop. And often I would spend time going through those old newspapers and looking at and saving, cutting out and collecting comic strips.
Oh.
That was my education. That's where I learned to draw from. So, Daily News. Daily News featured Dick Tracy, Chester Gould strip on the front cover. That was one of my favorites as a kid. During that time, it also featured Lee Elias's Beyond Mars. Elias was a Caniff imitator.
That's right.
Very good at it. And he had a very charming manner. Charm is something that almost doesn't exist these days. I said almost. There are some artists that can produce it, and they're very good at it. For example, like Adam Hughes.
Yeah, okay.
His work comes to mind, and he's really brilliant at it. But in those days, charm was a factor, was a selling factor in newspaper strips, films, and magazines and books and so forth. And I essentially grew up with old newspaper strips as my drawing lesson school.
Were you reading Jack Kirby books back then also, or did that come later?
No, actually, it may have come sooner because, you sure you want to hear this? I grew up with comics. My Uncle Eugene, maybe once a month, would bring a bag full of used comic books, comics he was through with, and bring them over for me to look at as a kid. And I mean, really a kid. My mother told me this story about 5 years ago. She said that she would put me on her lap and she had me pick out some of my favorite comic books. And I was the first of the children, so I dominated her time. And she would read the balloons that I would point to because I knew that that's what the characters were saying. So I'd point to the balloons one at a time and she'd read them. This is a story my mother told me.
Yeah.
And she said, that's how I learned to read. She said I was 1.5 years old. Mom, that's pretty damn early for a kid reading, 1.5 years. I'm not so sure I believe that. The following week, she produced a baby book. You know, mother's baby books, where she had how much I weighed and how tall I was and so forth by the year. And she pointed to this entry that she made when I was 1.5 years old, saying that I could read comic books.
Right.
And she said my mother and father, didn't believe it either. They thought that I had memorized the dialogue in these books or in these my favorite stories, and that I was simply remembering it and repeating it. So they covered over the pictures so that just the type, just the balloons were showing. And then they asked me to read it, which I did.
Wow.
So I'm guessing I probably started with comic books. I guess they're about as much in my blood as anybody could possibly be.
Right, that's amazing.
1.5 years old. And you know what? I'm still working at it.
Yeah, that's right. Who introduced you to the magician trade? Was that your father that introduced you to that? Did I read that correctly?
My father was an amateur magician. And somehow along the way, he subscribed to a magic course that had 60 lessons. It's called the Tarbell Course in Magic, Harlan Tarbell. Where he got the money, I have no idea because, like I said, we were too poor. In our house, we had no books. No books. We had no pictures hanging on the wall. It was a really barren existence. But somehow, and he may have bought this course before he was married, maybe money he earned as a kid, perhaps. My father, I think he told me he went to school until 5th grade. I think he was about 11 years old. And then he began working in the coal mines, standing in running water underground. Have you ever been in a cave? You know how cold it is in a cave?
Right.
Standing in a cave for 15 hours in running water a day, separating coal from shale and rock. That was his life.
Right.
So I guess it's okay that he could spend, some money to buy something he really
enjoyed.
Loved, the Tarbell Magic course. And so as a kid, I was an audience for him to perform, particularly at, if there was a little birthday party or a little celebration, that we had. We didn't have much, but he'd bring out this magic paraphernalia and do these tricks. And I think that planted a seed in my creative persona. And so the next step was that when the cat's away, how the mice will play.
Right.
Well, when my folks were away and I was home by myself, I discovered where he hid the Tarbell Magic course. And that's where I got my first instruction on magic and also where I learned about Houdini. And Houdini was very influential in my career because I found that there were similarities between Houdini's ideas, and things that I felt I was particularly suited to. For example, I always had good upper body strength. That's good for certain escapes, rope ties. I had a higher threshold for pain than I think many other people had. I have an eye condition. I'm very light sensitive.
Oh, okay.
I can see in the dark. I think the term is nyctalopia.
So is that why you always wear sunglasses?
Yeah, I wore sunglasses when I produced all of my comic books because the light bouncing off the page
really?
hurt my eyes.
So it wasn't just a style thing. It's actually like a necessity to just see what you're doing better.
I like to work in very lowlit areas because they're extremely comfortable for me. On the other hand, when I had my company, my business, my publishing company, and so forth, everybody was kind of depressed when they worked for me because the lights were always so low.
I see. That's funny.
Well, when I'm the boss, I decide how the lights are. When
That's
you're
true.
The boss, you can decide.
Yeah, that's right.
But bright lights hurt my eyes.
Okay.
Yeah, I drew all my comics with sunglasses.
Oh, that answers that question, actually. So now fast forward a bit, and this is a lot of years, but to your early 20s. And so you're well adept at the magician trade, and you're also a musician. This is, I think, in the mid-1950s, possibly, or maybe, actually, no, maybe in the late 1950s. You were doing rock and roll, is that correct? You were actually in a rock band?
I was in many rock bands. I played music and earned my living that way from the time I was 18 to 30.
There was something I read about the first go-go dancer on stage, that you had something to do with that. Is that correct?
Well, I invented the go-go girl.
Is that true?
Everybody knows that story. Come on. I'll tell you how it came about. In my area on the East Coast, just in my area, Musicians Local 235. Do I get some points for remembering that?
Yeah, you do. Mm-hmm. Good detail.
There were 300 bands in my little area. So the competition was fierce. And I think close to half of them were union bands.
Okay.
There weren't 150 clubs to play every week, you know. In the area, there may have been 30. Maybe in a 30-mile area, there may have been 30, 40 fire companies, you know, nightclubs, beer joints, saloons that featured music, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the competition was really fierce. You know, in the Philly area, Philly is a music kind of town, right? We know that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, rock and roll, Dick Clark, American Bandstand. I mean, the number of locations to play was maybe 1/10 that of the number of musicians who were in the area. The union plus the non-union musicians had to be easily over 300. So, how do you work? How do you find work? You have to compete. How do you compete? I was saying a lot of these guys were terrific musicians and performers. How do you compete? There's a problem that was very vexing at the time. I had material, new ideas, new concepts that I was promoting because I had already done magic professionally and I'd also done stand-up comedy.
That's cool.
So I was used to entertaining on another level, and I brought that kind of MC work into my rock and roll presentation. That was something that most groups didn't have. They played music, but they didn't entertain, you know, on the side. And I will make this one point. Some of it was very experimental. I remember that some of it was actually acrobatic. When I was playing guitar, I would climb on the shoulders of my bass man. He'd be playing bass and I'd be playing guitar on his shoulders, you know, part of this rock and roll show. You see what I mean? You know, trying to get an edge over the other bands. So one day I'm thinking, maybe I was talking to one of my girlfriends, a great dancer, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to put a really good-looking babe who was a great dancer on the stage and maybe put her in a little costume and make a thing out of it? And I mentioned this to one of the bars, one of the saloons we used to play at. I knew this place very well, used to play there often every Friday night for like 3 months in a row. You know, we booked every Friday. That was a big night, Friday nights. The guy loved the idea. And so I put the word out, trying to pick up a possible dancer to put on the stage. Where would I find one? I went to the tap dancing, acrobatic dancing schools because they must have had 50 kids that started when they were, 5 years old. And then, 50% of them continued on for 3 years and then they dropped out. But there were still girls in their late teens either teaching or being taught there. Well, hey, there's no market for it. You know, vaudeville's over.
Right.
There's no market for tap dancers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a kind of social thing. It's an art, but they couldn't earn any money. I went to all the studios and I said, look, I'm going to pay these women to dance on stage. No acrobatic dancing, no tap, nothing. They're just going to rock and roll. They're going to do the shimmy. They're going to do the twist. They're going to do the, you know, the popular dances on the stage by themselves. And then they were like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm saying, no, this could be a really cool thing. Nobody was interested. I couldn't find anybody. I couldn't recruit anybody to do this bit. And finally, after months of coaxing and looking and begging, I finally found a girl who would do it.
Oh, okay.
And we hit it really hard in newspaper ads. Guess whose idea that was? And we packed the joint. Miss Twist.
Oh, nice. Miss Twist. There you go.
Miss Twist. And this was at a time when Chubby Checker hit it big, right? It was a sensation.
Yeah, that's cool.
And the moment I did it, other bands copied it immediately. Now it became like a little trend, a movement. Well, how was I going to beat it? I put two girls on stage.
There you go. Double the entertainment.
So it was a matter of finding the right direction to rival anybody else and come up with constant new ideas.
Yeah.
One of them, for example, was that I had one of our girls, a pretty good-looking girl, do a kind of strip tease.
Mm-hmm.
We played 3 tunes like Night Train, which is a real bluesy, you know, burlesque kind of beat. And I designed a costume for this girl, one-of-a-kind costume made by a seamstress that would zip away pieces at a time.
Oh, that's cool.
And come apart. And we knocked them out with that. We played for about a year.
With that going on.
I don't remember anybody else that copied that particular thing, but I'm sure it was there. And then about another year went by. It's so long ago, you know, I'm only guessing. When girls dancing on stage became almost a national trend and the word go-go was coined. But I'd say I created the go-go girl, but not the term.
Right, not the term, but the actual action.
I'm going to take
pioneered
credit
that.
for it until somebody proves me,
That's awesome.
you know, otherwise. But every word is absolutely true. And we're talking about some pretty good musicians along the way, too. Bill Haley came from my area.
Oh, I see.
I knew Bill very well. I knew all the Comets. Can I tell you a Comet story?
Yeah, please.
Somehow, and I'm not exactly sure how, maybe it was in a conversation we had, Bill somehow knew that I was a commercial artist, a designer. And he somehow correlated an event with what I did. I'm still not quite sure how we got from A to B, but he came over to me one day. I guess we were playing the same gig. And he said, Jim, I want to show you something. Come on over to the truck. And we went over to his truck, and he opened the doors. And there was a one-of-a-kind, hand-cut wooden matrix for a Bill Haley poster. And the poster itself was probably something like 40 by 60 or 70 inches. I mean, it was the kind, you know, you put in the side of barns or something. It was huge. And it came in 2 pieces. And he had a lot of other hand-cut signs or imprints, you know, block prints that were used to ink up and print Bill Haley and the Comet posters. And he said, I'm fed up with carrying this stuff around. I just don't want to do it anymore. And he said, do you have any use for this? He said, I know you're a commercial artist. Well, I didn't have any use for it. But I felt that, first of all, it was a beautiful gesture, you know, for Bill to offer me that material, I thought, even though he'd probably throw it out otherwise. And I said, absolutely. And somehow managed to get it in a car, one of the guys' cars along the way. And there must have been other type and, I don't know, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen of these various block print, hand-cut wooden matrices.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have them. Maybe a memory, I have one of them at least hanging on the wall as a kind of a decoration. It's all full of ink. I mean, it's a mess. But, it's almost like Jackson Pollock, out of Bill Haley. Bill was the most unlikely rock and roller you could ever meet because he had split vision.
Like his eyes were crossed out?
They weren't crossed. They were in the opposite direction. Yeah. He lived about 20 minutes from where I lived. And can I tell a little rock and roll story that everybody knows?
Yeah, I'd love it.
Every rock and roller in America, every single one knew the words and the music to Rock Around the Clock because that was an emblematic song for the rock and roll era.
That's right.
And every musician knew the solo that was played on Rock Around the Clock. The solo was and has been attributed to, I have to think of this guy's name. It was a guy that worked in an orchestral background much of his life, recording and worked with big bands. He could read music. He was not a teenager. The solo was attributed to him, but actually it's bogus. The famous guitar solo that every rock and roller knew by heart was really cut by Danny Cedrone.
Oh, okay.
So I want to go on record.
Yes, okay, there you go.
Danny, wherever you are, setting the record straight.
That's right, you did. Now, also, as a man of many talents, while you're doing music for different clubs, you were also designing flyers and pamphlets for clubs that you were playing music for, is that correct? Or you were designing flyers or advertisements while you're doing this?
Rock and roll was like 2, 3, 4 nights a week, and it changed every week. And that wasn't quite enough to keep me busy. Might have kept some people busy, but always being interested in the art world, learning to draw from comic strips. And I should mention that one of my primary influences was the Johnny Hazard comic strip.
Frank Robbins.
Created by Frank Robbins, whom I ultimately got to know and hang out with.
Oh, you did? Great.
He had an apartment on Riverside Drive up in Manhattan. And the thing you didn't know about Robbins is he spent one day a week, I think one day writing and maybe one day drawing, Sunday and the daily, in one little place in his apartment. The rest of the place was dedicated to audio equipment.
Oh, okay.
He invented stereo-like material, and that took up most of his time. And one other thing about Robbins, who may be relatively unknown now, but I can guarantee you that many, many of Robbins, particularly his Sunday pages and his Sunday top, many of them rivaled that of Kniff.
Yeah.
Robbins, he also did one other thing that I'd like to point out to your listeners, and that is he was a genius at what's called spotting blacks, which is drawing the panel in outline in pencil and then putting in black areas, shadows, dark areas, dark costumes on characters.
Yeah.
And he was brilliant at it.
Right. And we see that with your work for sure.
I hope so. If I could be, just 10% as good as he was at spotting blacks, I think maybe my existence on this planet would be justified.
There you go. So then, as far as Frank Robbins, then, he also influenced Alex Toth as well, I think. It seems like he was actually a big figure in comic history as far as the art form. Did he bring, Noel Sickles style to, your generation then? Is that how you would look at it?
This is a difficult call. Who borrowed from who?
Right.
Kniff came first. Sickles assisted him, but Sickles also started, I guess, Scorchy Smith. Did Robbins assist Sickles on Scorchy?
I thought he did Scorchy, and then he went off to Johnny Hazard after that. I thought that's that transition went. And I know that Kniff had some influence from Sickles a bit, too, because they kind of looked alike for a little while there.
I often refer to the roots of style, of comic book style. The roots of comic book style are in newspaper strips.
Right.
The roots are the big three. Kniff, Hal Foster with Burns Valiant, and Alex Raymond with Flash Gordon. 95%
comes from there.
Every comic strip and comic book subsequent to that period were based on one form or another on those three artists, including, for example, Kirby.
Yeah, right.
Kirby was a big Kniff and Raymond fan, and if you look at Kirby's earliest works, you'll see him copying those styles.
Mm-hmm.
So the trio was massively influential on comic book artists and writers.
So you're designing pamphlets and ads, and you're doing music.
During my rock and roll years,
yes,
I was looking for other work. I was looking to develop my artistic talents.
Yes, the visual language.
And may I tell you how I got started?
Please, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
You man enough?
I think so.
I spent a lot of time at the Y.
Oh, okay.
At the Y. I was a bodybuilder there, and I spent a couple of years boxing at the Y. A really interesting story behind that one, but I don't think we're going to do that tonight. Maybe we'll do a feature film of it, and that way I don't even have to discuss it.
That's it, okay.
But I was at the Y, and one of the other weightlifters there mentioned that there was a new newspaper opening up in town. And that was unusual. We had a morning and an evening paper, Reading Times, the Reading Eagle, and they had a headlock on the newspaper business. But there was a guy who worked for that newspaper that thought he could produce a weekly tabloid that would bring people, let's say, more sensational news, more provocative, using more maybe local celebrities. And newspapers make their money not on single copy sales, but on advertising.
Yes, right.
Magazines and comic books, they don't make their money off of single copy newsstand sales. It's always exclusively on advertising.
Sure.
And this guy, Jerry Coburn was his name. Jerry had a lot of connections, and he thought he could fill his newspaper apparently with ads which would support it no matter how many copies he sold, whether it was 10 or 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
So right from the Y, I called up this new place, called the operator, and asked her if the Reading Record had phone service yet. And she looked up and she said, yeah, they just got it. I said, put me through. And the receptionist picked up the phone. I said, I'm looking for a connection to talk to because you're going to need a commercial artist on the staff to handle cartoons and ads. And, there's always paste ups and in the old days before there was digital stuff, everything was done by paste up. And by a wild coincidence, the receptionist was one of my old girlfriends.
Oh, okay.
Jeanette, who was also Miss Armed Forces. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Well done.
Miss Armed Forces. She looked like, hey, I don't care whether you believe me or not.
I believe you, man.
She was a little Elizabeth Taylor.
Nice.
And she recognized my voice on the phone. And she said, Jim, Jerry already had that figured out, the editor and publisher. He said, he just got a guy in here just this week. They had just opened up. He said, he's got a guy working back. I said, connect me with the guy. And she put me through to his phone, and I said, look, I'm a young commercial artist, and I'm interested in getting in the business. I'm particularly interested in the newspaper business. And he said, I'm taking care of everything. I'm it. I'm here.
Right.
I'm the guy. Oh, okay. I went home. I got my portfolio, and I brought it in. And I knocked on his door. The door was open. And he said, yes, who is it? And I said, I talked to you like an hour ago. I said, how can you tell me that you don't want me to be at least an assistant, at least to work on the staff of the newspaper without seeing my work? You cannot say no without seeing the work. Maybe when you see the work, you can say no, but I won't accept it. I said, I could be Michelangelo. You don't know.
Yeah.
But you can't tell me no without seeing the work. Well, he was stunned. And he said, let's see it. He said, I'm not sure it really matters because you're going to be an artist. You have the determination. If I told you that the job was taken and you bring your work in anyway within an hour, he said, I know you're going to be a success. So we'll work together.
Nice.
And that's how I got my foothold in the business.
In the advertising business.
In the advertising business. Now, we segue a couple of years down the line. His name was Fran. Fran Spots. And when I moved on to other things, I decided that I had the chops to work for a bigger agency, or a bigger publisher, printer, whatever it would be, designer. And I looked in the phone book to a place that was closest to where I lived. So I didn't have to drive, like 25 minutes to work or, 40 minutes or, I didn't believe in that. I could get there in a matter of 3 or 4 minutes. But I went to the place and I showed them some of my drawings, and the boss's name was Arthur. Arthur said, we really don't have enough work for you here, to hire a full-time commercial artist. And I said, hey, I can do more than that. And he said, like what? I said, anything that any of these guys can do, I can also do. I can handle it. And he decided to put me on. And I was there and really learned a lot over the next, 3 years or something like that, 3 or 4 years. I learned to make plates, to burn plates. I learned to photograph negatives. I learned press. I learned every single operation in the printing trade, which you use later when you published. An advantage for the rest of my life, because I knew how reproduction techniques worked, and that put me in a special category.
Yeah, it does.
In a position above Kirby, Romita, Toth, and all the rest of them, because they didn't go through this process.
Right.
But I knew it firsthand, so I had an edge, and I used that edge. Now, I had an altercation at this printing company where I worked with a guy who had been there for years, maybe 20 years before me. We got into a little brawl. He was a very aggressive and disagreeable guy. Nobody there really liked him, but they put up with him because they didn't want to be in a confrontational situation. But I come from a different kind of background, and I got into a fight with this guy. And I said, I think I learned all I could learn at this particular place. I'm going to move on. One of my customers was the head of an advertising agency. His name was Quentin Minker. And Quentin and I spoke the same language artistically and design-wise. And I got along with him really well as a customer. So I was thinking, why couldn't I parlay my association with Quentin maybe into another job? And so I quit at the printers, and I confronted my former business associate, Quentin. And I said, I think I have what it takes to be in the advertising field. I said, you already know my work.
Yeah.
You know how dedicated I am to making things happen exactly the way you want them to happen. And I'm going to do that here for you. And Quentin says, I'm not too sure what you're getting at. And I said, I've got to work for you starting tomorrow. And he said, no, Jim, look, all our positions are filled. The guys have been here for a long time. He said, we get along really well. I like your work, but there's just no place for you here. And I said, give me that piece of paper, a little pad. And I wrote a number down on it. And I said, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to work for you for 2 weeks. And if the work that I produce for you doesn't make 2 or 3 times the number that I wrote down on this piece of paper, I'll just leave.
Yeah, okay.
You'll have me for 2 weeks, and I'll do everything I need to do here to make things happen. I'll even empty that ashtray on your desk if I have to. I said, I'm a pretty good writer to begin with. I know something about writing. I know some of the rules. I said, so I can work from that area to illustration to design, and I have a production background that I'm not sure any of your guys have. And he said, Jim, come on.
Right.
There's no point. And I said, look, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. If I don't produce enough work that you can bill to your customers at 2 to 3 times the amount that I wrote on that paper, which is the salary I want from you, if you decide to put me on. I said, if you decide that I don't work out, that I don't make that kind of money, profit for you, I'll just walk out the door. And I won't confront you. There won't be another word said. Thank you. Thank you, Quentin, and I'll just leave. Nothing else, and you won't owe me a thing, and we'll be friends. I said, you can't turn me down. And he said, you're right. I can't turn you down. I said, I'm going to start tomorrow. I was there for 3 years, and I became the art director in 6 months.
So you had innate talent for this.
All the guys, they were all much older than me. I was just in my early 20s at the time. They really hated my guts because I was a slave driver. but we did some fabulous work, from billboards to newspaper ads to magazine ads, TV commercials, and so forth. We really knocked it out of the ballpark.
So you had all these visual techniques you're able to bring to various art forms that you got involved in with this experience.
Well, I was already design savvy. Just because an artist can draw well, that's draftsmanship. He draws the figure well.
Yeah, right.
Okay? He draws backgrounds. He draws cars and buildings well. He draws well. He inks well. That's draftsmanship. That has nothing to do with design. Anybody who thinks that is making a terminal mistake, because draftsmanship and design
different.
are at. I brought my design chops, my skills into the comic book world. It is not something that I can shut off. You get it?
Yeah.
I can't just shut it off and say, hey, I don't know what this is about. Every line I put on a piece of paper has to conform to my design skills, my rules, my knowledge. And so I brought typography, design, composition, and one other thing that I think is really the heart of comics, which is storytelling. Drawing, artwork is not the core of the comics medium. Comics are about narrative art or storytelling. And this is where I think many people in the business go wrong today, because the emphasis is on drawing great figures rather than telling great stories. We have a few guys who are really terrific at it, but not enough. And I think we're losing it. It's like sailing Spanish galleons. Nobody knows how to do it anymore. The focus is more on big figures and a lot of lines on paper. But that's not really where comics are a storytelling medium. I spent an enormous amount of time as a kid in movie theaters. And my storytelling sensibilities were informed completely by the world's greatest directors. And this is what I thought.
Yeah, movies, right.
Movies, film. My influences, Alfred Hitchcock.
Sequential storytelling, yes.
John Ford, Orson Welles, whom I knew, Henry Hathaway. These are the guys that influenced me, cinematographers.
Yeah, and then the way the story goes, okay.
I often hear this, who influenced you the most? My drawings, some drawings, are certainly influenced by artists that I've mentioned, Frank Robbins, Wally Wood, Jack Kirby, Alex Toth, Reed Crandall. I have many influences
but the movies.
I never went to school. I say that in terms of my storytelling abilities, they are entirely informed by the world's greatest director.
That makes sense. Because it feels like that when you read your stuff. It feels like it's a movie.
This is my philosophy. You go to the movies, you laugh out loud, you cry. When's the last time you picked up a comic book and you laughed out loud?
Yeah, it's
or
rare.
You cried. Not often.
Right.
That's because the world's greatest storytellers are in the movie business, not in the comic business.
That makes sense.
So my concepts of how to create stories and how to mount them essentially come from the film world. I was surprised very early on when I got to Marvel that my work was identified very quickly by fanboys who recognized a different kind of quality in the work, in the storytelling aspect of it. They would say, this is very cinematic. And they were right on the money in their perception. That was a very insightful thing for them to realize that there was something different. I didn't even know about it. I mean, it makes common sense, but I wasn't even aware that, hey, I want to produce this book or this series, and it will have a cinematic quality. That really wasn't on my mind.
Now, just a clarification. So then you're doing advertising. That's later 50s and early 60s, right? Just to be clear on the timeline?
Correct.
Was it during that time frame that this Julius Schwartz story happened where you stopped by DC and he showed you an Adam Strange comic? Is that around that time period?
It would have been around that time period. Maybe in the early 60s or...
early 60s.
Or the late 50s.
I see.
And New York was like my second home. I spent a lot of time in New York just out of, let's say, curiosity. I had nothing to do, one afternoon, and I was right in that area, and I thought I'd just stop in. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? They throw me out. I've been thrown out of better places than that before. So I walked in, and it was overlapping lunch hour a little bit. Maybe it was like 2 p.m, 1:32. And I went to the receptionist, and I said, I'm a big fan, been a comic book reader all my life, and I was in the area, and I thought I'd stop in to maybe talk to somebody here that could enlighten me on a few things, because, I don't know, maybe someday in the future, I might be one of you guys. And she kind of chuckled at that, and she said, well, everybody's out to lunch. Your timing isn't so good.
I see.
Okay, well, my timing wasn't so good. And then she said, but I think Julie is here.
Oh, really?
Would you like to talk to Julie? And I'm thinking, would I like to talk to Julie? Hey, I'd love to talk to Julie. I'm thinking about maybe Julie Adams or, and she said, okay, well, just have a seat. So I'm waiting for Julie to come in all her glory. And who do you think shows up?
Yeah, sure.
Julius Schwartz.
Right.
What a surprise. Well, Julie spent the next hour with me. He took me through the whole place.
Oh, cool.
And eventually some of these guys came back in, and I met other people there. And Julie was kind enough to answer all the questions that I had.
Oh, cool.
At the end of the visit, we went back to the reception area, and I thanked him for spending an hour,
that's nice.
Valuable time, with a dumb kid walking in right off the street.
But he must have seen something in you, because I've heard he's very picky about people.
That I wouldn't know about, but that day was a revelation to me. I had already met other people, known other people kind of in the business, but this was in a transcendental kind of moment. I thanked Julie, and he said, wait right here. Stay right there. Don't go away. And I'm thinking, what's this? And he left, and he came back, 3 minutes later, big pack of paper. And he said, this might be an inspiration to you. He gave me an Adam Strange story, Man of Two Worlds. The entire story, 26 pages, I think it was, or 26 and a half, I'm not sure. Beautiful Infantino.
Right.
And I think it was Murphy Anderson
inks.
One of the two.
Or Joe Giella.
Anderson.
Right.
And he also gave me the script. He said, this is the best I can do for you. And I still have that story and that script.
Oh, that's great.
And I think, in a way, Julie's kindness to me that day maybe made a difference in inspiring me to really go to the trouble to get into the business.
He was a positive influence at that time.
Very much so.
You're in the advertising world now. It's in the mid-'60s. You created a few character concepts for Harvey thriller comics with Joe Simon. Spyman was a character, and you did, I think, a one-page inside. You wrote a script for that. And then you went to Marvel right after. What happened with Harvey? Why didn't you stay there? And what made you go to Marvel? What led to that sudden change there? Seemed like you were on the move a lot.
I was really busy in those days. I was an art director at an ad agency. I was playing rock and roll 3 to 5 nights a week. And I didn't have enough space in my apartment. Had a lot of comic books and stuff that was just taking up room I didn't really have. And so I heard about a convention in New York City in 1965 called the Kaler Con, Dave Kaler. I packed up my girlfriend. She was maybe the last of my go-go girls. I had a white Cadillac, the biggest fins you ever saw in your life, filled with comic books. We went up to New York to the Broadway Hotel Central. And I remember we checked into the place, got our keys, went upstairs, and I was thinking, I don't want to have my comic books out in the street in my car, overnight. I better, think about hauling this stuff into the Broadway Hotel Central where the convention was going to take place.
Right.
And I remember coming into the room and snapping on the light. And I don't think I've ever seen so much movement. It was like the Big Bang, hundreds, probably thousands or maybe tens of thousands of cockroaches all over this room.
Okay.
Scattered to get away from the light. I think some of them actually went in the light switch. And that was more than I could handle. The Broadway Hotel Central. we got another hotel that night. Just as a capper on that one, I used to stay a couple of years later with my friend Phil Suling. Phil is the guy who started the direct comic
market
sales system. And he also threw the first biggest comic conventions in New York, Statler Hill.
Comic art conventions.
Phil and I were close friends, and I used to stay at his place. I remember we were eating breakfast one time. He lived in Coney Island in a high-rise, and he handed me this newspaper. And it was a photograph of the front of the Broadway Hotel Central, first convention, that had literally, the face of the hotel had fallen into the street. It had collapsed, literally. I think I could have predicted that years ago, but it was vindication, that this was truly cockroach heaven at this place. Anyway, I was a dealer at the show.
Oh, okay.
And just for the hell of it, don't ask me why, I can't tell you. I had done a little drawing of a gladiator. But it was a gladiator like you've never seen before, because he was half covered in chainmail and armor, only one half. That was the half that would take opponents' blows. In other words, his left half was covered with armor. His right half was naked. His right arm had no metal to impede it, nothing heavy except his sword arm. That would give him an advantage in terms of speed. I knew a little bit about edge weapons because I had fenced for about 3 years.
Right.
So I had this idea about armor that should have been for gladiators. And I had it taped up on the wall behind me. Well, just by a wild coincidence, Joe Simon, half of the Simon and Kirby team for years, attended the show.
Oh, okay.
And he was looking around and he came up to my table. I'm not sure I even knew who he was at the time, but he said, "What's that drawing up there?"
Yeah.
And I told him just what I told you. I was interested in edge weapons. That was an idea that I had. And he said, "That would make a hell of a comic book character." And he told me who he was. And I knew, of course, because I've been reading Kirby comic books since.
It's your year and a half, yes.
He said, "Do you have other ideas like this?" And I said, "Of course, endlessly." And he said, "Why don't you come out and see me?"
Nice.
He said, "Here's my phone number, my address. I live out in Long Island. Come out and we'll talk." He said, "I have an idea. Hey, what I have to lose?" I thought it would be fun to talk to Joe Simon, Kirby's partner for years. At the end of that show, Sunday, I drove out to his place and we talked for a while. And he said, "I'm starting a new line of comics for Harvey. I want to compete with Marvel." And I said, "Well, I already know some of your Harvey history. You had some interesting material there." And he said that the Harvey brothers felt that they could rival Marvel.
Right. With the superheroes.
"I think you have the possibility of delivering some interesting ideas, like that Gladiator that you had in the wall." Well, by the time I left Joe's home studio on Long Island, probably in the space of 20 minutes, I had a half a dozen ideas. I produced them as presentation pieces in color, and I sent them up to Joe. And he said, "I like this one, and this one." And he said, "I want to show them to Al Harvey, get his take on it, and I'll give you a call back in a week or so." And I think he did. One of them was a character I called the Sorcerer, which was about a kid magician and his Egyptian sorcerer mentor, the kid and the hero.
Kid and the hero sidekick.
So Joe felt that this would be maybe a little more than most writers, who have no knowledge of magic. Part of my presentation was that I could show kids who read the books how to do real magic.
Oh, that's cool. Like a nice gimmick in the comic of, here, you can do this trick.
Yeah, a couple pages, filler pages.
Nice.
Do this with a deck of, piece of paper and some scissors or whatever. And Joe liked that idea. And he said, "Can you deliver all 3 of these scripts?" And I said, "I think I can. I've been writing ad copy and other material for years already." And I turned in the 3 scripts to him. At that juncture, after I had done the presentation pieces in full color, full figures of the characters and the synopsis of what they did, and maybe some artifacts around them, I said, what's the possibility of me maybe penciling one of the scripts? And Joe looked at me with his 40 years of professional expertise, and he said, you can't draw. Oh, okay, I can't draw. That was in his infinite wisdom.
Yeah.
You know, he made that pronouncement. I think he had Jack Sparling draw one. Bob Powell, I think, did the Gladiator.
Okay.
Joe said, your names are no good. The Sorcerer, people don't know what a sorcerer is. I'm going to call him Magic Master.
Yeah, Magic Master,
and
right.
I'm saying, like, Joe, that's so unbelievably corny. You know, nobody would buy it. It's just, Sorcerer is the right... No. Nobody knows what that is. And he said, the Gladiator, that's just too plain. It's too simple. And I said, Joe, did you ever hear of, like, Batman, Superman?
Yeah, simple names.
Simpler than that?
Simple names.
And he said, no. We'll call this guy the Glowing Gladiator. And I'm thinking, what kind of hell did I just step into?
So that's why he left. It was editorial interference.
And I think by man, he left the way it was.
Right.
And I was so disappointed when the books came out. I think he hired me to do another second issue script or something like that, but I didn't get paid. And various promises, but no check ever came in. And I finally began to get a little more abusive, calling Joe. And I said, Joe, don't make me have to come up there. I know where you live. Don't make me have to come up there. I mean, it's just Harvey paid you for the work, You just got to send a check on to me. I had to beg him to pay me for the work that I turned in, not the characters. They didn't pay me for the characters. They already owned those characters. I couldn't get paid for the damn scripts, which was peanuts, whatever it was. And eventually I got some money out of Joe, but I said, hey, look, I don't mind spending this kind of time and effort, but if I have to beg to get paid, that's going over the top.
Yeah. So it wasn't fun at that point.
So I was hanging out with my friend and my mentor, Wally Wood.
Yeah.
The great inspirations and perhaps one of the most prolific and brilliant comic book artists maybe that ever lived. He could do everything.
That's right.
Well, everything. He could do funny animals. He could do superheroes. He could do westerns. He could do horror. He could do everything. War really well. I don't know, I may have been showing Woody some drawings, and he said, you're never going to be happy until you're in the comic book business. Until you make your statement, you will never be happy.
Right, that makes sense.
And I said, I'm not disagreeing with you, but, I already have 2 full-time jobs. What do I need a third one for? And he said, I'm going to call my publisher at Tower Comics.
Yeah.
He might like to see this work. You might want to talk to him.
Sam Schwartz?
Harry Shorten.
Harry Shorten, that's it. That's right.
Harry Shorten did this great panel in Sunday Comics, and I read it for years, and I loved it. I loved his work, and I showed him some of these drawings, and he said, yeah, I see what Wood means here. And we talked for a little while, and he said, do you have an idea for a possible character? And I said, I might have something that might do what Joe Simon and Al Harvey wanted to do, rival Marvel Comics. I said, I've got an idea for a character called Super Agent X, like the X-Men, X. And he said, hey, I like that idea. What's it about? I didn't have the vaguest idea.
But it's a great title.
I was just on the spot. And I said, well, why don't I develop some material for it? And he said, if I like it as much as I like these, you're going to have a 52-page book just like Wally Wood.
Yeah.
I was walking on a cloud.
Yeah, sure.
So I came back and I wrote in pencil the origin story of Super Agent X, took it back up there. And he looked at the pencils, 20 pages, and I had cover concepts for him to look at. And he said, hey, I like this, and I think it is something. It's done in kind of like the Marvel style.
Oh, okay.
He said, I think I can use this. You've got the book. Does everybody know the rest of this story? Can I really tell you the rest of it?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
So he said, you and I won't be talking again unless our paths cross in the hallway. He said, from now on, I'm going to turn you over to my art director, Sam Schwartz.
There you go.
And he said he was over at Archie for years, and I said, I think I remember his name. So he took me into this office, no bigger than a telephone booth. and a telephone booth with a couple filing cabinets in it, and I think it had a chair, one chair. And Samm began to look at my pages, and he began to shake his head.
Samm Schwartz did, okay.
Samm Schwartz.
I see.
Shaking his head.
So that's what happened.
I'm thinking, what does this mean? As he's going through, he cites an example. He said, you see this woman, scientist, that I had modeled after Kim Novak.
Alfred Hitchcock, the Vertigo girl.
Great beauty.
I had a big crush on her growing up.
We all did. So I put her in my comic book. Kim has a very cool nature, and I figure as a scientist, a woman scientist, she'd need a cool disposition.
Okay.
That's just right. And he said, I don't like the shape of this woman's nose. I'm going like, what did you just say? And I said, well, maybe you'd like her to have one of those, cute little pug howdy-doody noses like Betty and Veronica. And he said, you know what? I think maybe I would.
Yeah.
So anyway, he continues to go through the pages, and he's just shaking his head and, kind of grumbling about things. And finally get to the end of the book, climactic scene somewhere. I had our hero, Super Agent X, take out a pair of villains, opponents, by throwing 2 punches. Look, I boxed for 3 years. Are you going to tell me anything about throwing punches?
Right.
You're not going to do it.
And he was criticizing that.
And we got this little guy, little skinny guy, who looks like he just stepped off of a toilet ad. He's telling me about throwing punches. Now, we're in Fantasyland, comic bookville.
Yeah.
This isn't in the ring. We're not talking about reality. We're talking about fantasy fighting, right? Kirby set the style. Anything goes. There's nothing.
So he just kind of nitpicked the littlest things.
No, it wasn't that. I realized when he brought that punch, what he was really doing at that point is he was grooming me.
Oh, I see.
Grooming me to be his slave.
Okay.
He was the king, and I would be one of his slave boys working here.
Psychological warfare.
And I thought that was a very disagreeable thing, really nasty for a kid like me, right off the street. I had no experience, essentially in this business. My friend Woody brought me into it, and this guy's trying to make me a slave. I see. Very, very angry. And I said, you say one more word, and I'm going to knock you out. Because I was ready to punch him out then and there.
That's right.
I thought that was really unprofessional of him to do that to a kid just fresh in the business.
Right.
He was taking advantage of me. He was trying to take advantage of my inexperience.
Right.
To control me.
And you sensed it.
So I took the pages and left. I lost a 52-page comic book like my friend Wally Wood, bam, over the shape of a girl's nose. Could I make this stuff up? So I went down to Archie Comics, which was a few blocks away. And I went to the reception area, and I said, I'd like to talk to somebody about maybe drawing for you. And she said, would you like to talk to John Goldwater? Well, John was the J in MLJ Comics.
That's right.
And I knew that. And John came out, and he looked over my work, and he said, I don't think we have anything for you, but I'd love for you to draw all of our covers. And I liked John a lot. He was a really personable guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, John, today it's Super Agent X Day. I said, I appreciate the offer, but I'll have to pass on it. And from there, I went down to D.C., walked into the office, the same reception office I was in, that day with Julius Schwartz, and I had these pages under my arm, and I said, I'd like to show some pages to one of your editors. And the woman said, well, how about Murray Boltinoff? And I knew Murray's work. And I said, sure, absolutely. He was a cartoonist. I think Henry was the cartoonist and Murray was the writer. He looked over the work and he said, yeah, there's something. I like this. I like some things here. And I'm thinking, I just found a home for Super Agent X. He'll be the brother of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and the Flash and Hawkman.
Join the pantheon.
He said, no. He said, I'm not interested in Super Agent X. I want you to write for us. He said, I like the way you write. I like your pacing. I like your dialogue. He said, I want you to write for us. I'll give you a job right now, an assignment. I said, look, I appreciate it. Really, it's very kind of you, Murray, but today's Super Agent X Day. I got to make that happen. And he said, okay, I can't quite explain this to you, but I was running out of places. I went down to 44th Street and I went to Paramount, the building there, and I walked in and I knew they had their animation studios there. I can't explain this exactly. What the hell was I doing in Paramount Animation Studios? But hey, you roll the dice, right?
That's right.
So the receptionist said, can I help you? I've got an idea for a cartoon series. She said, well, what would you like me to do? I said, is there somebody here that could take a look at it, make a decision that I could talk to? 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. She said, there's a new guy that just started here a little while ago. She said, you want to talk to him? What's his name? Ralph Bakshi.
Oh, really?
He wasn't yet the real Ralph Bakshi.
Yeah, the one that we came to find.
Started. Ralph came out as a Brooklyn guy. We talked the same language. He liked the work, and he said, you ought to talk to Shamus Culhane. In the animation world, Shamus Culhane is as big a name as Walt Disney. A brilliant, brilliant animator. No kidding. He said, come on, I'll introduce you. Went into Shamus's office. Energetic guy. He solitaired all 20 Agent X pages out on the floor. Like he's playing solitaire, so he could see them all at once. That's what animators do. He laid them out on the floor and walking back and forth and absorbing this action and the characters, the costumes. And he said, you know what, this would make a hell of a Saturday morning TV series.
Yeah, right.
Sam Schwartz, will see you in hell. So he said, I want you to come back in 2 weeks. I'll have a contract for you. He kept some of my cover designs. Posted them on the bulletin board. He said, I want to keep these here to look at. Very inspiring. He said, you take the rest. My job was over. You know, I did what I set out to do. I have this trick that I used in my show business years of psyching myself up. I don't know if you have experienced that, but often when musicians, performers, actors, before they go on stage, they get themselves into a particular
mindset,
state, a creative state.
Yeah, sure.
And when I was driving up there that day, I got myself into a state, and I had done this, for years before that, selling people at the ad agency things and performing on stage, doing magic and all kind of other stuff. I got myself into a state where people could not say no to me. Couldn't do it.
I mean, I couldn't do it now.
So I thought it was 4:45 was the end of the day. I had 15 minutes left. You know how much trouble I can get into in 15 minutes?
Probably a lot, if you wanted to.
I took a cab over to Marble, and I got there about 5 minutes to 5, and they were close to the joint. And I went up to the 7th floor. Marvel Comics, walked in, and there was fabulous Flo Stein.
Nice, yeah.
Really cute. Go-go boots,
yeah,
short skirt, and
sure.
She was just really cute. I wasn't even caring about comic books at this point. Anyway, I said, I'd like to see Stan Lee. She laughed in my face. Nobody sees Stan Lee. So I grabbed her wrist, I levered her arm up, and I put my Super Agent X pages under her arm, clamped it down, and I said, Stan will see me. And I pointed to the door. And she left. And she came back about 2 minutes later.
Yeah.
And she had this stunned look on her face.
And he said yes.
And no pages. You get it?
He was looking at
And
it.
she said, it was like she'd been hit in the head with a ball-peen hammer. She was like stunned, drugged. She said, like, Stan will see you. And it was the cleanest office I've ever been in my life. Facing Madison Avenue. I think it was at 57th and Madison. Am I close?
Yeah, something like that.
It was right in the corner. I don't think it was in the corner office yet. Anyway, I handed the pages over to him, and I told him the story about Tower. I got into a fight, and he's looking through my pages, and he's asking me, like, who the hell are you? And I'm having a conversation with him about Kirby and Bill Everett and Johnny
Yeah.
Sins, the guys that I loved and I grew up with.
Yeah.
So we're having these alternate conversations. He'd do 2 minutes and I'd do 2 minutes. And, we were swimming. He got through all the 20 pages and he said, this work is really crude. But, and I'm saying like, but what? You got to fill me in or you got to make me guess. And he said, no, look, it has something here that I could really use. I could sell. I could market something that I see on these pages.
That's great.
I said, name it. And he said, your work ripples with energy. He said, I can sell that. And I said, so what are we going to do? And he said, you know what? All my books are taken. I don't have anything for you. Everything there. Hey, what the hell did I care? I just sold a Saturday morning TV series to Paramount Pictures.
I mean, you're on top of the world.
Well, I already had 2 other full-time jobs. What the hell did I care? So he said, I know what you're going to do. I said, fill me in. He said, I know you're going to go over to D.C. and in 3 months from now, you're going to be my competition. And he said, I cannot afford you to be my competition. I said, look, make up your mind. What's it going to be?
Yeah.
On the wall above his desk was all the monthly comic books. And he pointed to the rack and he said 2 words that changed comic history. Pick one. He said, I could have had Spider-Man. Pick one. I could have had the FF. I could have had Thor. But there's a word for competing with Jack Kirby or following Jack Kirby.
Right. To be right after those guys.
There's a word for it. Suicide. Hey, look, I might be crazy, but I'm not stupid.
Mm-hmm.
I picked the lowest book that they had. All these guys had really cool masks and colorful costumes and cloaks and superpowers and electricity, and they could fly, except this one joker. He had a cigar. I said, I'll take this guy, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., because I knew I had nowhere to go but up.
Right, that's true.
On that strip.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest is history.
So did you put a lot of ideas for Super Agent X, Spy-Man into that Nick Fury Strange Tales run?
No, I took Marvel's lead and went into another direction. For one thing, those were superhero strips.
Yeah.
And what I decided to do was kind of follow up on something that Kirby and Lee had developed, but they didn't know what to do with. You remember, Kirby did the first S.H.I.E.L.D. half-book story.
Yeah.
And then he moved on to other things.
And then John Severin or something.
S.H.I.E.L.D. was originally called The Man Called Death. D-E-A-T-H. But that was too harsh, too stark for comic readers, they felt. And so they changed Death to another anagram, S.H.I.E.L.D.
Right.
Which was a smart move.
Yeah, that's a good move.
And they imported Howling Commando's Nick Fury
Smart.
into it. But nobody knew what to do with it. It went from one artist to another. Johnny Severin, great artist, tried to do what he could. Nobody knew what to do with it. Finally, it got down to Werner Roth or something. I mean, it was awful. I think Buscema took a stab at it. It was truly pathetic.
Okay.
I believe when I took over, Fury was fighting druids in England. I could be wrong about that. It could have been even worse, but I mean, they just didn't know what to do.
Right.
Isn't it obvious? Fury had to compete with all these other cool superheroes.
Yeah.
And I figured the way to make him do it was to create super technology.
Right.
That would put him on a fighting par.
Yes.
With the rest of those sons of bitches.
Okay. There.
I could also do a number of things. I could also make him comic books 007.
Yeah, right.
That was important.
Especially in the 60s, yeah.
So I think Kirby and Lee made a terminal mistake by taking Foxhole Nick Fury and making him the supreme commander of Secret Service spy forces in America.
Right.
So literally, I shaved him on panel. I took away that 5 o'clock
you did.
shadow,
That's right.
which typified
from day one.
Fury.
Okay.
I took away those stogies, they were smoking down to like 1.5 inches, and gave him, some real cool Havana cigarettes.
Yeah.
Along the way.
You made him cool.
I gave him my tailor. I took him to my tailor. And even in one scene, I even gave him my apartment one night.
Mm-hmm.
So I revised Fury to bring him up to date and make him compete with the rest of the characters in the Marvel line.
Right.
This is what I was thinking of.
And skin-tight outfits and all that, right?
I put him in a zip suit, black leathers, so he'd have a similar look to those guys, and I literally dressed him up in weaponry. Everything he was wearing was just about a weapon. He's a human weapon anyway.
Yeah, right.
I'll tell you something you didn't know about Fury. You wouldn't like him. He's not the kind of a guy you'd want to go out drinking with at night because you wouldn't come back. Fury is not a particularly nice guy. He's just the world's most dangerous man. I mean, he's like Danny Trejo on speed. You know? He's just that. But he's not a likable guy.
Yeah.
He's just very, very capable.
Yeah, he's very capable.
When he says he's going to do something, it's a fait accompli.
That's true.
It's over. It's over. So I began to develop a whole series of technological miracles for him to tinker around with and tried to match it with my visuals, ultimately developing things like the maze page, where if you wanted to go from Act 1 to Act 2, you actually had, as a reader, to go through a maze to get to the next page.
Right.
Or you'd be stuck there. That's all you had to do. You actually had to go through the maze. I figured I could do this. On every other page, I could create $1 million set. That's how I competed with James Bond.
That's right.
Eat your heart out, Cubby Broccoli.
Yeah, because his loft, his fashion, everything was just a whole nother level when you took that character on. Did you feel yourself growing as a comic artist during that run, or did you just get more brave with what you felt like doing? And I've also heard that you also encouraged Stan Lee to then let other artists also start kind of doing their own thing and not stick so close to the Kirby aesthetic as well, because he liked your outcomes.
Not really. Those sons of bitches can fight their own battles. I'll fight mine. What did happen is when I got there, Stan's ruling for everybody, not only me, everybody, draw it like Kirby.
Right.
That's the house style. Draw it like Kirby. Hey, look, do you know the quintessential insult to an artist? Don't draw it like your vision, copy somebody else's work. Stan didn't mean it maliciously.
Right.
You know, he was just saying, this is our house style. You know, that's what he had in mind. It was a commercial thing. But I didn't like that. And I'm no Kirby. Kirby's the world's greatest comic artist. There's only one Kirby. I couldn't even pretend to be Kirby. Couldn't do it. I bring other skills, other strengths into my work that are different from those that Jack Kirby brings into his work.
Right.
And so I made a thing of them. Initially in the Shield strips, I brought my design sensibilities. I brought my compositional strengths. I brought my layout skills. I brought my storytelling, my narrative chops, taught by the world's greatest film directors into it. I brought other things too. I was still working. I still had 2 other full-time jobs. I was playing 4 or 5 nights a week, playing rock and roll,
right,
and holding down an 8 to 5 job.
And what about Peter Max, Andy Warhol? Do you feel like you put that stuff into it?
Not really. They were doing, Warhol was copying comic panels,
right,
and blowing them up and making them,
true,
fine art.
That's true.
There was nothing for me to copy.
That's right, because he's copying comics, yeah.
Except there were times when I brought a pop art quality into the work. And I can tell you something that I never told Stan because I know he'd hit the roof. I worked on 3 separate levels. The most basic level was for kids who were maybe 5 years old, couldn't read. They could understand my stories just by looking at the pictures. I always had that foremost in mind as I drew my stories, that there was something they could understand. Maybe not all the subtleties, if there were any subtleties, but the nuances of the stories. But they could still know who the good guys and the bad guys were, and they could follow the story. Got it?
Yeah.
And then I did another level for the young Marvel comic reader, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds who were the basis of the comic book market, and they read it on that particular level, a kind of straight action, thriller, suspense kind of a level, standard comic book stuff. And then on top of that, I wrote for the college level. I'd often create scenarios, characters, scenes, dialogue that would be so over the top, it would be satirical. I mean, you couldn't help laughing if you really thought about it. So I was working on those 3 separate levels, trying to find 3 different audiences simultaneously. And it must have worked because eventually, instead of splitting Strange Tales with another character, and doing his 12-page stories, Stan called me up one day. And it doesn't happen often in the lives of comic book artists and actors, too, for that matter. Sometimes actors work for 5, 8, 10, 15 years, They're working behind the scenes. They're doing one line, dialogue in a commercial or a TV series or something. They've been there. They're building sets. And every so often, I get a call from their agent saying, "Hey, kid, I just signed you to star in a film. You got the lead. You got to be a star." And that's just about what Stan Lee said when he called me up and said, "Hey, kid, you got your own book.
That's awesome.
You got to be a star." So I knew I was doing something right.
Did you enjoy working with Stan during those years?
I enjoyed working with all of the guys up there. They were my heroes.
Yeah.
They were my heroes, my childhood heroes, and many of them were really special to me. Frankie Giacoia and Joe Sinnott inked my work. I say that they took my really crude, in the words of Stan Lee, my really crude amateurish drawings and turned them into professional material with their inking because they were such great artists. I think Joe Sinnott put me on the map.
You feel like the way Murphy Anderson did for Carmine, you feel like Joe Sinnott did something similar on your pencils?
No, Carmine was already there. He was already a skilled
I see what you're saying.
Technician. But Frankie G and Joe Sinnott added a new dimension to the work that wasn't there. They made it look professional.
Right.
I wasn't ready quite yet to get there, but they added the extra element that really worked. You don't know how much I fought to get those guys to ink my work. They were Marvel's top inkers. And to get them to ink the books, I had to do a lot of fighting.
I see.
I'm not kidding, a lot of fighting to get onto my book and my schedule. They were essentially scheduled for the top books, for Thor and FF and the big selling books. But along the way, I found a few kinks to make it happen. I had a great rapport with Stan. We lost Stan this week. Stan is a very congenial guy. The guy that you see on those interviews on TV shows and on his cameos, that's really him.
Right.
He's that way all the time. He's a very charming guy. On the other hand, I'm a very confrontational guy, and as soon as I sense anything going wrong in my world, I don't care who you are. I'll be in your face in a moment about it because I'm prepared to fight for what I believe in. The only thing I regret at this moment with Stan, a lot of confrontations along the way. And some of them weren't very pretty. But I'll stand by my philosophy. It's like this. Marvel, like all other comic book companies, they pay for words on paper. They pay for lines on paper. But unlike every successful company in the world, they do not pay for ideas. You know how GE stays on top? You know how Apple stays on top? They have a whole team of guys that they hire just for ideas.
Right.
They keep their product competitive by thinking of new and exciting developments all the time. But comics don't. I only ever did 29 books for Marvel. Maybe not even for Marvel, but 29 comic books in my life. That number is significant, by the way. Do you know that number? Do you know that number? 29? You know what that is? You know the great blues guitarist at the Crossroads? Robert Johnson. He sold his soul to the devil at the Crossroads. It's a very famous story. And he recorded 29 songs.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The only difference between Robert Johnson and me is that I sold my soul to Stan Lee. Simple as that.
Right.
There are two Canadian professors that mounted a show of my work years ago. Maybe it was in the 70s or mid-70s or maybe the 80s, but I think it was maybe in the mid-70s. Winnipeg Museum and Art Gallery. And the show was massive. They actually built a wall. They built a wall in the museum to house some of my work.
That's great.
In the course of our interviews, these guys are very savvy. They said, do you know that you created 76 things that had never been done in comics before? I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, really? Okay, so they cataloged the things that you pioneered.
They produced a book, the catalog for the show, which was a thick book. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I think it's called Graphic Narrative, the title of it, Steranko Graphic Narrative.
Oh, okay.
And that really interested me because as a lifelong comic reader, I couldn't think of another artist, even those that were extremely prolific, like Kirby or Kane, for example, or Johnny Severin, that really produce something new. I'm not talking about new kinds of pictures where this character is on the left and this is a close-up. I'm talking about storytelling tropes, devices that are used in narration. In other words, like in films, for example, the lap dissolve where one scene turns into another, or a straight cut where one scene, bang, ends and another one begins, or a wipe. You know what a wipe is?
Yeah, and it transitions.
Spielberg used it in the Raiders movies.
Right, and Flash Gordon had that.
One scene kind of wipes across the screen
into a new one.
Right. Those are the kind of devices I'm talking about. They're narrative devices. Even knowing Kirby's work, the warrior god of comics, I couldn't find more than, I'm not even sure, 2 or 3.
Right.
Thinking about this over the years, talking about it here and there to people who really knew the form, who really knew about comics. I met a guy, James Romberger, in New York, who's a writer and an artist, very famous, terrific guy. Do you know who I mean? Works for DC, did some stuff in the Vertigo line.
Oh, okay.
Very savvy guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's a teacher in his own right. He said, I counted every page in your 29 books, and I found 200 things that had never been done before. And I said, did you list them? And he said, absolutely. I said, send me the list. I'd like to see them, because I just don't think this is possible. I looked at his list. I knocked out 50 of them that I had seen before in comics, and I knew that they weren't original.
That they weren't right.
That left 150, and I'll stand by that 150.
You pioneered those.
Can I tell you a few of them?
Yeah, sure.
They range from large to small. Why not? They cover the whole spectrum. In one of my comic books, I had an actress who was doing a scene with her leading man, and if you've spent any time around film sets, you know that what you see on screen and what happens in real life could be two entirely different. There's an enormous amount of jealousy and hatred that goes on in movie sets, regardless of those people that sit around in chairs doing promos. If you really knew. So anyway, I tried to convey this idea without actually stating it over a 3-page scene, right? It was in nuance. And so I gave my female actress a balloon in a scene, and the balloon was empty. You know how women are? Did you ever get the silent treatment from a woman?
Yeah, sure.
Well, then the silent balloon. Never been done in comics before.
That's pretty cool.
To make it even cooler, I drew a couple of bicycles underneath it.
There you go. That's nice. That's good storytelling.
So you see, they range from very small.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one of the biggest ones. I think I was the first in comics to do a 9-month story. A story that lasted 9 months. The Yellow Claw.
Yeah, that was a great one.
It lasted almost a year.
Mm-hmm.
Never been done in comics before. And I'm kind of grooving along, month after month, telling this story. And I'm getting to the end now. This is why I wanted to end it. It went on long enough. I made my statement. And I'm thinking, I really got to come up with a big finish. Because if you tell a little story, if you write a little story that's like 300 words, you can put a little joke at the end, right? But the bigger the story, the bigger the novel, if you write a 900-page novel, you had better come up with one hell of a climax.
Hell of a good ending, that's right.
You will be tarred and feathered if you're lucky. You follow me?
Yeah.
We'll cut it out. It makes me nervous. So, here we are at the end of this 9 month, and I'm thinking, I got to really put a cap or climax on this that knocks everybody out. I didn't have an idea. I was ready to move to Guam. I just didn't know. And simultaneous to this, I happened to be watching a James Bond Ken Adams set. And that's where I got the idea. Something had never been done in comics before. And of course, I wouldn't dare tell it to Stan, because anytime I told him anything that I was going to do ahead of time, like this,
yeah, he would say no or something.
He'd stop me. Don't do that. Just do it like Kirby.
Right.
Just do it like Kirby. So why would I tell him?
So you have to turn it in somewhat right before the deadline, and then they have to print it.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I have a kind of reputation for being late with my material. Completely bogus. I was never, ever late. I'm a pro, but this is what happened. When I brought a story in on Monday, it was due on Thursday. It would give them 4 days to tinker with my work. That's the way it was in my Marvel years.
Right.
Do I look like the kind of guy that would put up with tinkering with his work? I was talking earlier about every company in the world paying for ideas except comic book people. I was giving them what I call innovations, things that had never been done in comics before, 150 of them. They never paid me a cent for any of them. Those are major developments. They are being used in comics now. Not all of them, but many of them. I never got paid for them. I should have been paid for them. The treatment of creating something new that had never been done in comic books before, not just hitting my Xerox machine and grinding out the same stuff that I did, over the last month, year, decade, like many artists. I was giving them really new, fresh ideas and not getting paid for it. And then on top of that, I had to fight for it. Wait a minute. I want to be paid for my work. And if I have to fight for it, I want to be paid for fighting too. Is that unreasonable?
Right. It makes sense.
So Stan and I had these many conflicts. Anyway, all said and done, 150 innovations that I gave them. And often, when I used to bring my stories in on time or early, they'd wipe them out. They'd destroy them. They'd change them. They'd reconfigure it. They'd take these things away that they didn't understand. That's painful to create. And having somebody who just is thinking along the old threadbare, traditional ways of doing things that have been done that way thousands of times, but this is the way we do it here. You got it? I worked at the House of Ideas. Don't make me laugh. So when I brought the climax of this 9-page story in, without telling Stan what it was, and I brought it in at the last moment. I brought it in Thursday afternoon, an hour before it had to be sent to the engraver, right? That was, how long it took me to figure out bringing my work in at the last moment? That's how I got my reputation for being late.
Right.
You know how long it took me to figure that out?
Maybe 4 months.
Took me about 2 seconds.
2 seconds.
After I saw they changed my work, that was it. So I brought the climactic scene to the Yellow Claw saga in at the last minute. And the innovation was that I did it over the climactic scene over 2 double pages, 1 panoramic scene, 1 really ass-kicking, spectacular scene. And I laid it out on Stan's desk, and I said, here's the end of the story. And he hit the roof. Oh my God, Jim, why must you always do this crazy stuff? Why can't you just do it like Romita? Just do it like Kirby. And I said, Stan, you don't get it. And he said, I don't get it. I've been the editor here for like 30 years or whatever it's been, 40. He said, I don't get it. And I said, no, you don't get it. Don't you understand? They have to buy 2 comic books and put them side by side.
That's right. Get all 4.
Great idea, Jim.
Yeah, there it is. A sudden turnaround.
See, I wasn't talking his language there for a moment. So what I'm saying is that my innovations range from massive down to
random little details.
Atomic size.
Right.
Along the way. I believe Jim Romberger mentioned this in a book, or maybe he did it in an article first when talking about the innovations. I think he said that if you took every new idea on a storytelling level that artists contributed, every one of them put together, not only wouldn't they match that 150, my contribution in 29 comics, I think he said you could multiply them 10 and they still might not be there. I think that's my legacy.
That is. You're leaving Marvel around 1969, 1970. You're writing your history of comics volumes, and you start your SuperGraphics publications, and you start getting a book deal to paint covers for books. So was one of the reasons why you left Marvel, other than just kind of pushing against the grain and it getting kind of annoying after a while, was because you had so much more going on that you just felt like you wanted to grow in those other directions?
That's one way to say it. I figured I had done all I could do for Marvel. You mentioned earlier that Stan would coach his artists by saying, do it like Kirby. I didn't know this until Barry Pearl, who wrote a couple of books about Marvel, kind of really heavily researched. Barry discovered that somewhere along the way during my Marvel tour, Stan began to tell his artist to draw it like Steranko. I never knew that until Barry discovered it when he interviewed various artists from period that was kind of after my Marvel tour. So I figured I had made a significant statement at Marvel. I do a lot of things. One of the things I don't like to do is to repeat myself, like being a human Xerox machine and grind out the same
repeating the same stuff.
I don't do that. And I figured it was time to move on, especially since I was still getting resistance.
Yeah, the resistance.
On an editorial level. And I think I had had about enough. If I hadn't proved myself by that time, I'm not sure I wanted to go on, at that particular level. I probably could have had my own way. I think I was the only guy at Marvel to that point writing and drawing his own material.
Yeah.
Who else did it?
Yeah, you packaged the whole thing. Yeah.
And then I colored my own work too. So I was the only guy maybe ever that did all those three things at Marvel. I certainly had a lot of autonomy, but I was still not at a place where I could experiment to the level that I wanted to. And maybe Stan was correct in not allowing me to do that because Marvel readers wanted Marvel material. They didn't want experimental Steranko stuff. The 150 innovations is maybe all they could possibly stand. And I can tell you something. There are still some of those that people don't even know about, that haven't yet been discovered, which I think is a pretty wild idea. They're so subtle. They're so nuanced in the stories that people have yet to kind of catch on. On the other hand, many of them have been adopted and are being used today by artists who don't even know where they came from. They came from the books during that period, the Shield and the Captain America books that I did. And one other book that we haven't mentioned, and I'll just bring it in because it was my most controversial story. It was in a horror comic book, Tower of Shadows, #1.
Right. And he didn't get the Lovecraft implication in it or something, and that created some argument.
He wanted to call
to change the name.
Let Them Eat Cake. I wanted to call it The Lurking Fear at Shadow House. Mm-hmm. And I think it had another title. I'm not too sure what it was.
And that's when you quit, right? From a conflict over that.
Yes, we had an argument about that story. Stan looked at it and he wanted to change things. It was really my most inventive and experimental story. And we got into a altercation and I said to Stan, here's where I stand on this. If you change one word, find yourself another artist. And he fired me on the spot.
Right, okay, so he fired you actually. Okay, I got you.
He fired me. I've never seen Stan mad. Have you ever seen Stan angry?
No, of course not.
Never seen him angry. That was his moment. We made up, but I no longer did stories for Marvel.
Covers.
I do think it was the top cover artist for 3 or 4 months.
Did you kind of pick and choose which covers you were willing to do? Were you experimenting with different genres when you were picking those different covers?
Not really.
Okay.
Not really. I mean, I'd get a call from Saul Brodsky and he'd say, hey, Jim, I got 3 covers coming up. Can I get them in 2 weeks?
I see.
Whatever.
So it's kind of more casual like that.
And I took whatever they had. I thought I could make my point philosophically by changing Marvel's look, adding new, fresh concepts and ideas. I think Stan paid me for a story that you don't know about called Dante's Inferno.
I think I saw maybe 2 pages of it.
It was a suspense thriller with a hero.
Mm-hmm. And it didn't look Marvel enough, right? Wasn't that the deal?
It had no feathering. It was in a style that was fresh to comics.
Right.
Stan, he said, this is not a Marvel story. And I said, am I in the house of ideas?
Right.
And I knew he'd change it drastically. And I said, forget it. They had already paid me for the story. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'll just do something else for you. I'm not giving you this story. It's just too good to spoil.
Right.
By changing all of these ideas. I said, the ideas have great value. The story may be worthless. But the technique that I used, the narrative technique to get there, I think has enormous value to you.
Yeah, I see.
If you don't feel that your readers deserve that, as I created it, I'll just pull the story and I'll do something else for you. And I did another experimental story.
The romance comic.
The only romance story I ever did.
Yeah, which is beautiful. I love that comic.
It was the only story Stan ever wrote for me.
Oh, okay.
It was our only true collaboration.
Nice.
He wrote every word in it. We did it Marvel style, but he actually wrote every word. Didn't give it to Roy Thomas to edit and
I see.
And so forth. My Heart Broke in Hollywood. My Heart Be Still.
That's a beautiful piece. I've looked at that quite a few times. When you started SuperGraphics Publications, you use a lot of techniques that you learned throughout your advertising years and whatnot. And you use that to make a few things. You use that to make the history of comics, the Comixscene, which then turned into Mediascene and then Prevue. Then you use some similar techniques to make the first FOOM, the first 4 FOOM fanzines. It seemed like stylistically, Comixscene and FOOM looked somewhat similar to me when I looked through them.
I thought that there was room in the comic book world. Comic book fandom was exploding because of Marvel Age. And most fan publications were really amateurish. I mean, they were run off on little... The machines had names that we can't even think of these days. They weren't even Xeroxes.
Yeah, mimeograph?
Something.
I don't know,
They were really, really crude duplicators. They wore out the Matrix in like 30 copies, which were typed on a piece of wax paper to make copies from. Anyway, the fan world was very amateurish at the time, and I thought I could deliver something really professional, which is why I created Comixscene. Comixscene printed on web presses like newspapers and magazine technique. It was a very sophisticated publication. You have no idea the amount of tricks that when they ran them so that I could do things right there on the press that even those pressmen didn't know about. One of my tricks was to create 4-color work on a 2-color press. Guys said, that's impossible, but I know how to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that saves a lot of money.
Yeah, right, it does.
When Stan decided to
make a fanzine,
do another Marvel
Mania
Society
type thing, yeah.
That was the result of many conversations that I had with him. I saw that Marvel was exploding across the cultural world, everywhere. And I said, you're sitting on $1 billion operation. To give you an example, they farmed out their advertising department. All the ads in Marvel Comics were done by a separate company. I said, that company should be in-house. That should be a Marvel operation. Why should these guys, done it for years, benefit from your success? You can control that right here. You should be controlling your own destiny. That eventually happened. He instituted that. I said, you should be aiming at film and paperbacks. You should be exploring other mediums. And the world is ready. They're going to accept it. And Stan's comment was, Jim, I'm already so overworked. All I can handle is my comic books.
Right.
And I said, you have to relegate. But Stan is really not so good in doing that kind of thing. I mean, he's great, doing what he does. But on a business level, there's something to be desired. Mm-hmm. Okay? I'm not faulting him for that. Few artists, few writers have that ability. But I was kind of laying it out for him. Anyway, all of the conversations we had on this level, I think finally materialized when he decided to bring back the Merry Marvel Marching Society and call it Friends of Old Marvel.
Yeah, right. He came up with that name, right?
He came up with the name. But because I had been hounding him about this, he said, maybe you could...
There you go.
Maybe you could edit, design, construct the content of this book, give it some real persona. Here's where you can bring your imagination, your inventive graphic quality into it, because it's a separate entity from the books. And I like that idea a lot. We had dinner one night with Saul Brodsky and me and a guy named Ivan Snyder, who he had brought in to do marketing, and we made the agreement. And I made it irresistible for Stan and for Marvel because I took no payment.
You didn't actually get paid to do those first 4 films?
No.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I designed the whole kit. The Marvel poster, the whole membership came in every one. It was a fun show.
Really? So you just did it for fun?
No. I said to Stan, I want you to pay me, but in a way that will cost you nothing. I said, I want 2 pages for myself out of every one of these books, 2 ad pages.
There you go.
For myself. I do with them whatever I want. And what I want is to promote my own products.
Okay, that's cool. That's a good idea.
Cost them nothing, right? And when they saw how successful it was because of that, other powers, and it certainly could have been some of those people. I don't really lay this on Stan because he just doesn't think in this direction. But I think somebody at Marvel got very greedy. Hey, why should we be giving this stuff away to Steranko when we could do it in-house?
You're right.
I already created the master plan, so they took it back.
I see.
I think it lasted something, I could be wrong, 22 issues. They beat the horse to death, as far as it would go, and they couldn't go anymore, and that was it. It was dead, and bang, the end. Don't you love it when people are so smart, they outsmart themselves? Perfect example of it.
So what was the creative bug that had you make Red Tide Chandler graphic novel? And would you call it a graphic novel?
I call it the first American graphic novel. It's not a fat comic book. What you're seeing on newsstands is fat comic books. That's not graphic novel material. Yeah, let me put it to you another way. How many pages is normal comic?
22 pages or something.
22 pages. Okay, suppose I added 5 more pages and made it 27 pages. Would it suddenly transform from a comic book into a graphic novel? That's a yes or no question.
No.
Okay, suppose I added 10 pages and made it.
Right. There's
okay,
like a
suppose
certain.
I added 30 pages.
No, yeah, length isn't enough of a definition. It needs like a serious narrative. It needs like an adult. Book. Yeah, it has to have some adult theme in it.
What makes a comic book? Do you know? There are 3 things. The size, 7 by 10 pamphlet. That's a comic book. The second thing, sequential art.
Yes.
That is page after page of panels and balloons, right?
Yeah, balloons,
panels and balloons.
Right.
Balloon is a comic book device.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to look up the definition of novel in the dictionary and tell me if it says balloons.
Yeah, you're right.
It doesn't say balloons.
It doesn't say balloons. Yeah, that's true.
And the third thing is a holding line around everything. That's a black line that traps the color. Those are the 3 things. Yeah. If you take one of those elements out, for example, if you take panels out and put photographs in, not a comic book anymore. If you change the size of it, like down to digest, it becomes a digest, not a comic book.
Right.
Comic book is 7 by 10.
I gotcha.
So if you change any of the elements, it becomes something else.
Yeah, the name changes.
Something else. So the idea of just adding more pages is completely and utterly meaningless. A graphic novel, to qualify as a novel, should have about 50% text, 50% imagery. You get it? Graphic novel.
Right.
That's about a 50-50 split. I mean, if you want to really create a definition of the graphic novel, that would help to define it, 50-50 split. I put together Red Tide, created Red Tide, split the page into 3 sections, and a third of it was text and 2/3 was imagery all the way through. And it had chapter breaks, like a real novel, chapter breaks.
Right.
That's another thing. And the third thing, which you alluded to a moment ago, was content. Complex themes,
right.
Complex characters.
Yeah.
And particularly if they're adult, will get them more into the novel area. But you can also have juvenile novels, if you want. We're talking about some subtleties here, but those are the elements that create a graphic novel. I created that format specifically to conform to the term graphic novel.
Right.
You want to hear the story of how it happened?
Yeah.
My friend, and he was like family to me, Byron Price.
Yeah, right. That's who published it, right?
Was producing heavily illustrated books of one kind or another.
Right.
I knew him from the time he was 16 years old, or 17. But he was just a kid. I met him at one of the New York conventions. He was really sharp, and we spoke the same language. And for years, for decades, he and I have been talking about all these things like graphic novels and really advancements of the comic book form. When he was in a position of power, he decided to adopt the things that we had been talking about for generations. And he decided to produce a line of illustrative or illustration was in the title. And he had, I believe it was Steve Fabian, do the first science fiction book. That may have been the first or second, I'm not really sure. But it was a comic book in digest form with panels. and balloons and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going out to lunch. I remember it was high winds, and we were going to one of our favorite deco diners, one that I happen to like a lot, and I like the food there too, but I like the ambiance of the diner. And he began telling me about a new publisher he was working with, and a guy named Norman Goldfine that had come in, who was very open to new ideas. And I think I had been reading that day or that week a story about Harold Robbins, who went to his publisher. He was the most successful author in America. He went to his publisher one day and he said, I got a little idea for a new book. And the publisher said, I'll buy it. And he said, you didn't hear about it yet. He said, well, okay, tell me. He said, I call it The Adventurers. The guy said, I'll buy it. We'll publish it. He said, but you don't know anything about it. And he said, well, what else do you have? I really don't have the characters in place yet. I just know I have this great title, The Adventurers. Well, what's it about? No, I don't have the vaguest idea, but I do have a great title. You agree? The publisher says, absolutely. Here's an advance, $80,000.
Oh, nice.
You know, guy says, I got a title, $80,000. After lunch, we went over to Norm Goldfine's office. He wanted to introduce me. I said, you know, I think we can really produce not a digest comic book or not a fat comic book, but a real graphic novel. Are you interested? And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm going to design a format never been used before, but when people see it, they'll really know it is a graphic novel. For one thing, it'll be very cinematic, but it can be read like a novel because it has text and no balloons. And he got very interested. He said, what's the story about? Hell, I just got the idea in a cab ride over there, you know? I really don't know. I don't have that worked out yet. Well, who's in it? Who are the characters? No, I can't tell you who the characters are in it yet. It's too early to say at this point. I'm thinking about this Harold Robbins story that I read, earlier that day. And he said, well, do you have a title? And I said, yeah, I do, Red Tide. And he said, I love it. And I said, is it a deal? He knew about it. He was one of my fans. He was a Marvel fan. He knew my work. It wasn't like I was just
some schmuck, yeah.
Him, and he said, I love it. I'm going to give you an advance right here. He wrote the check out for me.
That's great.
Right on the spot. That's my Harold Robbins.
And you used a lot of the blacks, like you were talking about with Frank Robbins and Noel Sickle style. You used a lot of that.
I did not.
Because it seems like there's like panels that look that way to me when it's in black and white.
That's because they looked like images on the screen from the great noir films Hollywood produced from about 1938 up into the mid-50s.
I see.
Films like Sweet Smell of Success, photographed by James Wong Howe.
I see.
Not Frank Robbins.
From the movies and the directors.
Or Out of the Past, the great Jacques Tourneur film.
I see.
With Kirk Douglas.
It's more on the movie spectrum.
So those images came from cinematographers such as Woody Bridell.
I see what you're saying.
Who shot The Killers, I believe.
Okay.
John Seitz. And from that resource, I wanted it to look like movie.
Like more movie.
Not like comic.
Not like a comic.
Not comic strip panel.
So it's a different artistic statement altogether.
And even the narrative technique from panel to panel and page to page does not play out like a comic. It has a different feel to it. The feel is cinematic.
Right, it is.
That's where I was going. You're looking at my images saying, you know what? I've been here before. I wanted you to just about hear a Miklos Rosa score as you were reading my book. That was my goal.
This is just more of a random question. Why did Mediascene's name change to Prevue? And that's around when it started turning to more of a slick magazine, right? What was that transition about?
I told you I had this idea initially to create a publication for comic fans called Comixscene.
Right.
Comixscene. And we were pretty successful at it. They weren't used to these kind of graphics and higher end stories and really penetrating, insightful interviews and great art in big sizes. I could compete with any magazine with my layouts, my design sensibilities. You'd open those early issues, you'd never seen anything quite like it. Bam! It was right in your face.
It was.
So I felt that after maybe it was like a dozen issues, Comixscene, that I was limiting the scope of material. I'm a pop culture guy. I do not live entirely in the world of comics, but in the worlds of music, of cinema, literature, architecture, dance. I'm interested in many, many things. So it was natural for me to bring some of those things into this publication because I felt that you guys would be interested in reading about some of those things that I know a lot about, and you could know what I know if you read the magazine. So I changed the name to Mediascene, embracing wider areas
Different media.
of media. Our circulation continued to build. It was pretty successful. And we reached the point where my distributors, and we took surveys and, we tried to find the right market. And we did promotion and there were things going on. And I finally got this feedback from the public and from distributors that the word I had coined, media scene, there is no word like that. I coined that term. They said, people don't understand it. Is it a medical magazine? And, they just didn't get it. And when I had enough of those comments, I realized that in order to grow, to be successful, I had to take a different tack. And then I called it Prevue, Mediascene Prevue for a while. And then I dropped the Mediascene and just called it Prevue. Magazine, which was like previews of coming attractions. And by that time,
there's more movie
getting deeper and deeper into
Hollywood.
Into the cinematic world because the market was bigger, reach more people, influence more people, and maybe make more money along the way.
That makes sense. That leads me to the next question. 1981, you did Outland, the Sean Connery film graphic adaptation for the Heavy Metal magazine. And in that same year for Hollywood, you designed the Indiana Jones aesthetic all around that same time. So you really went into the Hollywood scene pretty good around 1981 then.
I've always been interested in film. You know that. I remember the first time I went to a movie theater. I was just a little kid. And sitting in this huge, dark room with strangers surrounding me. It was one of the most alien things I think I've ever experienced. And seeing this 30-foot high image running, playing, whatever they were doing, was staggering to a little kid.
Big impression it made.
Oh, I remember the first movie I ever saw. The Mask of Demetrius, Warner Brothers film. So it had a profound impact on me. I've always been a cinematic guy.
A cinematic kind of guy.
You'll see the show up again and again in my work, in my writing, and my artwork, my painting. I refer back to this sensibility often.
When you made the Indiana Jones aesthetic, that imagery, when you look at every Indiana Jones movie and you look at every Indiana Jones cartoon or whatever, or the TV show, it all goes back to that design you put together. That flavor is everything to Indiana Jones. So what fit into the influence of that design?
I believe that Lucas and Spielberg were comic book guys. They're from our generation, and we spoke the same language. I use that several times, but that's an important thing in my life. If I connect with people that I speak the same language to, I know I'm on the right track. The timing was very early. Stephen and George had developed about 30 pages of material on a beach in Hawaii during vacation. What do great filmmakers do when they're on vacation? They talk movies.
Right, that's true.
What else can they do? They came up with this idea because they loved movie serials. They loved adventure films. They loved the comic book sensibility. They wanted to create something that had all of that magic, that action, that kind of hyper romance in one magnificent package. And they needed somebody to define what it would look like. What are the rules graphically? So they asked me to produce, I think, a half a dozen presentation pieces with various scenes. And George and I had conversations about the content. We talked about the 30 pages and sort of where it went. I pulled out 6 of the best kind of images visually that people would be interested in defining the look of Indiana Jones, and painted them, sent them off. I remember, I think I had all the paintings done except one, and I had a show that weekend, which I think was down in Atlanta. Producing those paintings in one day, especially if they had a lot of stuff in them, it's not easy to do one day, because that's not a pencil drawing.
It takes time to do that
paint,
stuff.
it's photographic to make it look realistic.
That's right.
That's my style. And I called George's assistant up and I said, would you pass something along to George? I said, I have a show to go to tomorrow. I'll be gone for the weekend, but I can come back and finish this in a couple of days. And she talked to George about it, and George said, we'd like it now. So I didn't sleep that day. It's the one in the Inca tombs. That was done in one sitting.
Oh, wow.
When I
That's
sat
incredible.
down, the board was blank. When I got up, the painting was done. And then I went to Atlanta,
that's amazing.
an hour later.
And were you drawing from like pulp influences, or was that just out of your imagination?
Well, you asked me a question, did I research? I already knew all that stuff.
You already knew it all.
My life.
It was all in your mind anyway.
And George and Stephen knew that, I didn't have to study. Studying for it my whole life.
Right.
It was a natural for me. I remember how cool it was. George and Stephen took the 30 pages of script and my 6 production paintings over to Paramount. See if Paramount was interested in developing it, and bam, they got the money right away.
Wow, that's a whole series of movies from that.
2 years later, first rushes came in. Rushes? That's raw footage. It's not color corrected, no music, no, dialogue necessarily.
Right.
Dubbed in later, just raw footage. I got a call from Carol Titleman, George's personal assistant. She said, we just got the first rushes this morning, looking at all this raw footage, she said, and we were stunned about how much Harrison Ford looks like that guy you painted 2 years ago, in those paintings. She said, couldn't believe how much it looked like that.
That's amazing.
So I guess it was a case of, I don't know what you call it, deja vu or something,
Right.
I happened to hit the nail on.
Yeah, you did.
On the head.
Superman 400, what made you decide to try comics again after kind of being deep into the Hollywood stuff at that point? Julius Schwartz.
Julie also remembered the kindness that he had shown me.
Oh, yeah?
That very fateful day when I walked in and I was just a kid. And he spent an hour with me, and he said, I might have to call in that favor. And I said, sure, what's on your mind? And he said, this milestone issue, Superman 400 coming up, we want to do something special. So we're asking artists who have never drawn Superman before to contribute to issue 4. He said, and you're on the top of my list.
Wow. Because you had a special dedication to him at the end of that, I remember.
Very heartfelt. And I said, I'll do 10 pages for you on one condition. Whatever you get from me, you use. You get it, you use it. Don't change a single word, not a line, not a word, nothing.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. You have no editorial power on it. You have to guarantee me, even though you're Julius Schwartz, and I'm only a lowly comic book artist and writer, you have to promise me that nothing will happen. He said, Elliot is writing the book. Julie, what did I do to deserve that? What did you say? I said, why did I get that slap in the face?
You want to write your own thing?
He said, what are you talking about? I said, I'm a writer. I've written millions of words, published millions of words. I said, you just slapped me in the face. I am a writer. Why would I have somebody else write my work? Oh, Jim, come on. I didn't mean that. Well, I only know what you tell me. And, you want to have somebody else write for me. You know what that would mean? It looked like every other story in the book. You just want to fill 10 pages, whatever it is, with standard stuff. You don't need me to do that. You already got it. I said, look, I know Elliot. I like Elliot. He already had the assignment to write the whole book. I said, well, then where are we? He said, look, I'll give you Elliot's phone number. You guys work it out. I called Elliot up. Elliot, look, I just got this call from Julie and blah, blah, I want to write my own story. Sure. Go ahead and do it. That's all there was to it.
That's awesome.
And so I delivered a very un-DC-ish story.
Unconventional, yes.
He never had anything like it before or since. However, I noticed that it shows up in their reprint of DC Greatest Superman's or something. I don't know what.
Yeah, of course.
Something like. So somebody must have liked it.
Someone liked it, yeah.
I said to Julie, I'm going to write and draw the last Superman story that can be told. It's the end, fini, after the story. I can live with that.
So Bram Stoker's Dracula, that was 1992 or so. And you actually did designs for that movie as well, the aesthetic. What led into that experience, design-wise?
I've had a fair number of offers from Hollywood over the years to work on feature films, but I'm really careful about who I collaborate with. And I just turned down those that wouldn't be assets to me. I don't particularly like what they produced. They're low-end pictures, or I don't like the content, whatever it is. But I find it very gratifying to work with the best in the business, like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Oliver Stone and Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, sure. Artists.
So I try to keep my Hollywood assignments as pristine as I can. Good productions where I know the people and what they do, I'm already familiar with them, and that I feel I could get along with them. And I get a call from Francis out of the blue. He was familiar with my work, and he felt that Dracula was a project. I might have been the third person hired on that picture, really, really early. He said, I think this is something that you'd enjoy doing. He said, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, I don't know how you can go wrong working with Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, right. These are great filmmakers, this list.
The godfather of American film culture.
Mm-hmm. It's huge.
Any better than that? I don't know. Not that I know of. So he flew me out there, and we worked on it for about 7 months, all total.
Oh, that's a long time. Oh, okay.
Produced a series of production paintings. I didn't stay out there for 7 months. I came back and, I was back.
Right. But working on it. So it wasn't just a one shot one afternoon. I mean, you were actually involved in this movie.
Francis would bring me in, well, because I was in very, very early, I was involved on many, many levels, from casting to specific scenes. And I had a lot of ideas. I regaled him with ideas.
Nice.
Francis is an idea man himself. And we spent entire days together. Whole days, full days. I'd just sit in his office and we'd talk. He'd be answering the phone. I'd be privileged to listening to these private conversations that he had. I learned then what a really tactful creator could be like, because overhearing these conversations with movie producers and about money and, some of it was so exasperating, I couldn't handle it at that level. But Francis was so good at it. What a pro. I learned a lot working from him. We'd brainstorm ideas constantly and develop scenes and reject them and recreate them and recast them. And, we spent our time just juggling around for a while. And this came really close. I said to Francis, there have been like 150 Dracula films. They're all over the place. Francis's idea was to do the entire Dracula novel. Usually the movies end at a third into the book. And he wanted to
do the whole thing.
Be kind of true to the book, and so did Jim, the writer. That purity interested Francis a lot. And if there's anybody who could do it that way, it would certainly be him. He contributed enormous amounts of material as a writer to the Godfather movies, for example. All of his movies, for that matter. He is maybe first and foremost a writer. So we spent this kind of development time brainstorming. I loved to do it with him because when Francis would bring somebody else in and begin to talk about the film, virtually every time he told the story, the same story, let's say half a dozen times, over the period of several months, from beginning to end, you go through the whole story with somebody. He always told it differently.
Oh, okay.
I was flabbergasted by that, because you think he would be finding things that work and how to say it and, keep honing down to it. But he didn't do it. He always brought in fresh takes. The thing I was going to tell you about was after all of these films, and we were screening the old Dracula movies, what we might use and what we were inspired by. And I said, Francis, I can't help feeling that worldwide audiences are really tired
of the same thing,
of seeing the same old, murky rooms, the same candelabras. And he said, what are you getting at? And I said, what do you think about moving it up into the 1930s, in the Deco era? I'll design clothing that's still rooted in turn of the century, but has this modern quality to it. I'll make it up. I'll make up the architecture, the clothing, the hairdos. I'll make up this whole new world, but they'll be in cars instead of horse-drawn coaches and wagons. I can see Dracula walking up. We'll take away all this shadowy, dark, gloomy. We've seen it 150 times. There isn't any more to do with this. I said, let's put him in a marble castle. White marble, stainless steel. I said, can't you see Dracula walking up this marble staircase, and on the walls, beautiful photographic blow-ups of the most exquisite women that he's known through the ages. Francis would pick up on this idea and he'd elaborate on it. And then I'd pick up an idea that he had and I'd elaborate on that. We'd spend days just brainstorming what Dracula could be. But we came close. We really came close to moving it up into the 30s. He loved that idea. I think the screenwriter convinced him, to do the Bram Stoker version.
So now, why did Prevue end in 1996?
I had done so much, almost 100 issues, and I had covered the same actors, the same directors, the same screenwriters, the same musicians, doing the same kind of material so often already that there wasn't anywhere else to go. I became a human Xerox machine. I could not live my life that way. I saw something else happening too. The age of the magazine, the dominance of magazines.
Internet kind of destroyed that.
Have been deeply mitigated at that time by the internet. And I saw what was coming, 5-10 years down the line when you could get anything on the internet seconds after it happened instead of months after it happened in magazine production and distribution and shipping. And, it didn't work anymore because my concept was Prevue. You know how exciting movie previews are, coming attractions?
Right.
That was the concept of my magazine. I wanted to show you what you're going to see, next week, next month.
Yeah, that's right. Internet, social media kind of takes that out. What's your feeling on the modern comics industry as essentially a conclusion of our interview?
Not something I'm too deeply involved with, although I did a year's worth of variant covers, several of which were #1 bestsellers.
Yes, that's right.
On the Diamond charts. And I've done a number of Superman variants, like on Superman 1 or Action 1000. And I've got one coming up that you don't know about, Detective 1000. And I think it was the only artist that made the cut on Action 1000, Detective 1000, and Captain America 800, all milestone books.
Nice.
So I'm still involved with the form, but I've got so many other concepts and ideas that I'm working on. And I think disposable income is at its highest that it's been in the last 12 years. And I think the timing is right now for me to develop and perhaps realize ideas and concepts that I put away over the last 30, 40 years because they were too good to give away to companies.
That's exciting.
I think I'm ready finally to be my own boss on those things.
On those ideas. That's exciting. That's exciting to know that there is always some nice pioneering Steranko on the horizon, because I think everyone's always curious about what you're going to do next. And I think everyone who tries to kind of figure you out, they can't, because you're this creative force. You're a real dynamo, and you're a man of your word, and you're a real unique individual. And I feel really lucky to know you and talk to you today. Thank you so much for doing this interview with us. From a heartfelt standpoint, thank you so much.
Appreciate that very much. And with little luck, you and I will have another conversation when I have an array of material in front of you, and you can ask me how that happened.
I am excited about that.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jim.
Take care, Alex.